Hello and welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one big idea at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
And our co-host today is Matt Tebbe. Matt is an Episcopal priest at the Table in Indianapolis and the co-founder of Gravity Commons, a community that helps people develop a post-deconstruction Christian spirituality rooted in love that fosters resilient faith in everyday life. I first found Matt through his steadily insightful posts on social media. They've helped me tune my perception of current events and capitalism and fascism and all these other heavy things through a more Christocentric and I would say power critical lens. Matt, we're really glad you're here.
Thanks. It's so good to be with Brandon and the translator.
Brandon, the translator.
Yeah, it's good to have it.
Can you just say a bit more about what in the world you are doing on social media? Because you are a steady and thoughtful conversation and voice out there.
Yeah, what am I doing? Well, I work by myself, and I'm a verbal processor, and my 12-year-old and my 16-year-old don't care much about Mammon or tyranny. And so, we have conversations and whatnot during the day, and my wife's an accountant, and there's only so much she can take. So I'm really just trying to work out what do I think about things. And that's one thing. Another thing is I've had writer's block for a long time, meaning just trying to sit down and write something. And so when I get an idea and I want to noodle on it, I've got into the habit of just like getting it out as quick as possible. So you'll notice sometimes in my writing on social media, I'm not using much punctuation or capitalization. It's more sentence fragments. And that's mostly for me just to get things out. And then, so it's like a creative writing practice, a verbal processing thing. And then two, around 2016, between 2016 and 2020, I began to feel increasingly a burden for people that wanted to follow Jesus, but they couldn't, their conscience couldn't abide following Jesus the way everybody around them did, or they got kicked out of their church, or they lost their church, or their church closed, or those kinds of things. And so I found, and I've been a pastor for 25 years, and I found I had a particular burden for people that, seemed harassed and helpless, etc. And I found one place to say things to them was social media, because a lot of them came online, found online communities because they lost their local community. And so I felt a particular burden, obligation, responsibility to say things that other white Christians were reticent to say, and to say things for their benefit. So I began to blog or post about things like church abuse and Mammon and racism and misogyny. That might be it. And then increasingly fascism and authoritarian supremacy, and all its friends, because I felt like those are things that a lot of people are having to leave churches and even the Christian faith over. And as somebody who has no plan to leave the church and no plan to leave the Christian faith, I thought, well, what if somebody who represents the church starts saying the things that got those people kicked out? Would that be of benefit to them? Would they be encouraged by that? Could that do some kind of reparative work, not only for me and somebody who's learning about this stuff and maybe has said opposite things or been silent for a long time and needs to make repair in some way, but also for people that feel like they can't think these things or say these things and be a Christian. And I want them to know you can. If you want, you can. So, I don't know, that's a smattering of thoughts about what I'm trying to do on social media.
Great. Thank you. So we are going to be talking this week about Matthew chapters 6 and 7.
Yeah.
If you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, for those of you watching, we're going to have it up on the screen here momentarily. And for those of you listening, we highly encourage you to read through. There's a link to it in the episode notes. Be sure to check out the footnotes as well. Lots of important nerdery in there. So go ahead, hit pause, y'all, and give it a read. All right, welcome back. Let's talk about Matthew 6 here. Brandon, what's the flyover for you on this as you were translating it?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different stuff in here. Um, I think what struck me big picture is how much financial and economic language is in here. So talking about the payment that you'll receive, and debts being owed and shortfalls and all those things. I'm like, man, this it sounds a lot like money. It's not talking about money directly here at the beginning of the chapter, but then it starts getting really explicitly into talking about money and assets and accumulating and stuff. It feels like this is connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the translations you've done here and elsewhere have been actually surfacing and making explicit the economic metaphors that and not just metaphors, just
Hmm.
economic language that Jesus is using that gets kind of
Right.
concealed.
Yeah, I think sometimes it is more metaphor, but I think more often than, at least in the tradition that I grew up in, we give it credit for it. No, he's actually talking about money here.
Hmm.
Um, and we need to pay attention to that and not feel like as Americans that the American virtue of accumulating wealth is somehow aligned with Jesus because it is not.
And so why is the Lord's Prayer right in the middle of all this then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's he's getting to some very just practical things. Like up above is talking about compassion work, helping the poor. Um, and then this prayer is about like give us the food we rely on today, release us from like monetary debts. Don't let us come into a time where we're experiencing hardship, oppression. The,
Hmm.
we have hyper spiritualized a lot of this prayer traditionally, but I think it's very practical on a daily level.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, in the sense of being the kind of people that are accumulating power, notoriety, prestige in by being famous for praying and fasting is really counter to spending the time actually being with people who are in hardship and making a difference for them in practical ways.
Yeah. Let's jump
Yeah.
right
What?
down to the some meat here in 19 through 24, where it culminates in you can't be dedicated in serving both God and wealth, which is usually mammon. Um, Earlier, Matt, we were talking about how mammon is kind of one of these regular themes in your writing. How did that emerge as a centering thing for you? And why do you use mammon language? What is
Yeah.
this? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Man, there's so many thoughts. I actually think this whole chapter is organized. I think this whole chapter is speaking to poor people. And I didn't know how to read this chapter until I listened to how poor people read it.
Mm.
Hmm.
And I can say more about that with, in particular, the three spiritual practices that Matthew goes after: prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. They're all spiritual practices of the wealthy and affluent. Who has who has time to stand in a marketplace and pray so everyone can see them? The one who doesn't have to work.
Mm.
Who has money to give away? It's the one who's wealthy, right?
Mm.
And there's correlations and backups here when Jesus, talks about the widow's mite, right? That she gave
Right. Right.
all that she had to live on, she gave more, I tell you. And man, I can't tell you how many giving campaign sermons I've heard where she's the example we're supposed to emulate. But in the context of the passage, as you guys know, she's not the example to emulate. She's the example that condemns the religious leaders
Hmm.
because they're devouring widows' houses. And then he starts talking about this widow.
Absolutely.
And then fasting. You know, fasting is only a spiritual discipline if you aren't starving.
Yeah, it has to be a choice
It has
for
to
it
be
to
a
be discipline.
choice. And 50% of the people in Jesus's day were living hand to mouth. And like you said, Brandon, like the Lord's Prayer is a prayer of the poor.
Mhm.
You know, at least 50% of the people had uh, had sort of day-to-day food insecurity. And so there was an actual anxiety about that, a
Mhm.
worry about that, which then Jesus picks up later about worrying about our life, what we'll eat or what we'll drink, in the
Mhm.
chapter. So I think there's other places too that poverty is the subtext for what Jesus is focusing on here in all of the Sermon on the Mount, but in particular in chapter 6. So anyway, that was a long preamble to respond
Yeah.
to your question,
Yeah. No.
which is
Yeah.
I'd heard this text applied so often in ways that made money a primarily problematic in the realm of the of your desire.
Mm.
That money's spiritual danger was in whether or not you loved it too much.
Yeah.
Um, so I can say way more about that, but I don't think that's correct.
No.
Good. Yeah.
Um, and so then because I think most of us in the Western white Christian world, especially those of us who come out of more evangelical churches, for us, the way that we experienced our church or our tradition sort of dealing with money is some kind of financial peace university, get out of debt, save money,
Hmm.
and then give
Hmm.
10%, right? Something like that.
Yep.
um, but I came to see through how poor and marginalized people read these texts that money functioned not on the level of interior, personal, private, abstract feelings, but
Hmm.
money has a logic and a common sense and asserts values that function on the level preconscious, subconscious assumptions, paradigms.
Hmm.
Money sets itself up as a god in ways that you don't know you're worshiping it.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
that's how it's most powerful is you're obeying it and you don't know it.
Hmm.
And you see that in a lot of Jesus's teaching. And so then to specifically answer your question, I think when I realized, and you mentioned this in your translation, Brandon, in a footnote, that mammon is an Aramaic word for wealth, but and in Aram, and they also had a god named Mamona. So there was this idea of divinity or deity, spectral power behind wealth
Yeah.
that was worshipped. And
Yeah.
Jesus using that term when there were plenty of Greek terms he could have used. I mean, Matthew could have used plenty of Greek terms to
Sure.
to
Yeah.
to 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 name it. I just felt like that's not a coincidence.
Hmm.
There's a
Yeah.
there's
He
a
didn't translate it. He took it like
yes,
this word that Jesus chose was important for its own sake. Yeah.
yes, and he uses worship language here, like serving, like a slave. You can be, and it's the
Right.
same language that he's talking about, and he's comparing this to God. You can serve this God or this temptation. No, you can serve this God or this God.
Hmm.
And
Here's
be
here's the
formed in the image of it.
yes, right. Yeah, you become what you worship, right?
Hmm.
Right.
And so that was like an arresting thing. So I don't know what it was, one thing, but it was like reading this with the poor, realizing how money works, mammon works, and then realizing how Jesus sets up this showdown between two rival gods. The only really rival god he mentions. And I just thought it
Yeah, this is
was,
true.
what would it change if I started to think about Mammon as the god of this age?
Mhm.
What would change for me if I took seriously that
I mean,
Mammon's
certainly alive and well in America.
yeah, yeah, if Mammon has still had regnancy, if Mammon still made claims on our lives, if we still paid obeisance to Mammon, what would that look like?
Hmm.
Where would it show up in my life? How would I see it, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah. The seminary degree I got was like intercultural studies. So it was sort of the missionary degree.
Yeah.
And they spent so much time talking about syncretism and other religions in a like zero sum win-lose game, but only in explicit theistic alternatives. The
Hmm.
paradigm of the Gospels, and I think in Paul as well with his principality and power stuff, is
Yeah.
why are we only talking about other like, yeah, religion and economics are so fused together that we have to in our day learn how to really name domination systems
Yeah.
as the gods, as the alternative religions, that we must not syncretize, we must not mingle service to the machines of war and patriarchy,
Yes.
or and mammon. Like start
Yes.
Hmm.
capitalizing these things as like as if they are named deities and
Yeah.
renounce them in
Right.
your baptism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the oh, go ahead, Brandon. Go ahead.
I was just say it's so much simpler if they are statues that you can see, like in
Yeah.
Ephesus talking or in Corinth, where it's talking about do we eat meat sacrificed to these idols or not? I don't know. It's the only thing available to us, but I mean, it made it simpler to notice it, not necessarily simpler to know what to do with it. But here it's Jesus is very much like you don't even know you're doing this, and it's
Mm,
happening anyway because there's no statue that you're bowing down in front of.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the ways that Mammon inhabits modernity is that we have a bifurcated cosmology. And what I mean by that is we see things as either material or spiritual.
Hmm.
This is one of the bargains that religion made with modernity was, we would retreat from the sacramentology of the world and
Yeah.
we'll go over the domain of the material to things like science. And science is opposed to religion, right? Eventually. And so it's become something then that doesn't have anything to do with the spiritual realm. And so now we have these two distinct domains or arenas. And so then things like money are material.
Right.
They don't have a spiritual quality, you know? They become
Hmm.
spiritual as I either make an idol of them or not. And that way of thinking
mm,
is poppycock. And
Yeah.
I'm not anti-science. I love science, right?
yeah.
But I think that's one way our frame or our constructs, the spirit religion evacuated the external, physical, communal
Mm,
world and it
Hmm.
retreated into interior, private, abstract, individual worlds.
Right.
And that deal has then made us so susceptible to the principality and powers of this age that operate in very material realities.
Hmm. Yeah, it strikes me that even if we did affirm, yeah, there's a distinction between the material and the spiritual, we might miscategorize money. It's money isn't a thing on its own. It's there's metal for coins and cotton and paper and all these other materials for bills and, you know, digits in bank accounts, electronically. But none of that's a thing that exists without us deciding it has meaning.
Yes. And
And
value
that is
and
absolutely
power.
where the
Yes.
spirit of it comes from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the spirit that the story that it holds collectively, and then begins to, um, it's almost like a recursive dynamic where even if we don't think it, it still has that energy that it keeps propelling itself forward. It,
Yeah.
how in the world do you hold sacred space, liturgical space, formational space in a way that is stepping more into this cosmology in this sense of renunciation of this false god of Mammon?
Yeah. Yeah, that is actually, I mean, quickly, I think very quickly where I got, I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but started relooking at Jesus's parables and teachings of the Old Testament, New Testament, taking money more seriously, right? And if it is this, if it does have this, if it's wanting to make what we would call spiritual claims on us, and it is dangerous and opposed to God, then where would I see that show up in the scriptures, right? It's just a fun little, next time you try to read the Bible through the year, just keep that in mind and just see what you notice, right? Because it's all over the place. But quickly you get to this place of, dear God, my hands are covered in mammon,
Mhm.
right? I'm an unclean man living with unclean lips and unclean land. And how the heck would I ever extricate myself from just from the dominion and the destruction of Mammon? And so then very quickly I got to a place of just like apathy or despair. I either go completely off grid and like
Mhm.
divest myself of everything, renounce everything,
Yeah.
go all Saint Francis of Assisi scorched earth on Mammon, or just like screw it. And I think
Yeah.
I haven't chosen either of those, which is not comfortable.
No.
It's not comfortable to say I am embedded in a political economy that runs on Mammon, and I am compromised and complicit in a myriad ways I'm aware of, and in more ways I'm not. That's not comfortable, especially for somebody coming out of a largely white Protestant evangelical tradition that stresses purity above all else. So it's really hard to reckon with how Mammon reigns and maintain your primary identity as the right one, the pure one, the good one. So that's one of the reasons why it's hard to account for it, is because we need different categories than just guilty, innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You
Right.
know, like in the Old Testament, when Jewish people contracted ritual impurity, which was common, which wasn't sinful, they didn't have to ask for forgiveness the way we think of forgiveness.
Right.
But their ritual impurity, if it was major, would impact the Old Testament sancta. It would impact the sanctuary and the furniture. So they had to take responsibility for their ritual impurity. Otherwise, it would become a moral issue because that
Mm.
contamination or impurity, if you will, would build up on the sanctuary, and then it would compromise God's presence and ability to be there. And then eventually it ended in exile, right? And
Yeah.
so to
So
me, I
you're
think
saying
about,
that the failure to take responsibility is what ends up becoming the moral issue.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And they can take responsibility in a way that doesn't leave them paralyzed or guilty.
Yes.
Hmm.
They actually have some reparative in their cosmology, some reparative work to do to clean, to purge.
Mm.
So we're not even working on a grid of like, um, immoral moral at this point if they actually are operating
Right.
according to that logic.
Yeah.
But we are operating on a different spectrum. So, sorry guys, this is not Matthew 6, but it just occurred to me
No.
this is an analogy for what we're
It's
talking about.
relevant. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the holy common binary and pure impure binary, right? Um,
hmm
but the whole purpose of the Old Testament sancta, and if you want more on this, Lamb of the Free, Andrew Rillera, he breaks it down and it's incredible. But you had to keep the holy out of touch with the impure. That was the whole thing here. That impurity can't build up, can't become contagious or build up or come into contact with the holy thing, because then that would compromise the holy thing. And it's because the Hebrews in their cosmology had this um had this spectrum of death and life,
hmm
and they saw holiness as a symbol or constituting life, infinitude,
Yeah.
and they saw impurity as representing, symbolizing, signaling death.
hmm
And so their entire ritual sort of apparatus was to keep death from overwhelming and contaminating life. Yeah.
Mhm.
So for me, that schema then helps me better imagine and be creative in living in what I see as bondage in a world in bondage to death, the way of Mammon.
Yep.
And how do I then take responsibility for how that impacts me to work towards life, to clean and purify
Yeah.
based upon what I have access to? So
And it
that gets me out of being paralyzed.
hmm
and it's a communal thing. For them, it was a communal thing.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
it's not about your culpability is distinct from your complicity in these systems, and individual actions is different from this common responsibility that and we together and we as individuals have. And not
Yeah.
in the space of like sacramental space, ritual space, liturgical space, to help us make meaning of being courageous and stoking our imaginations for how do we actually cleanse ourselves, our neighborhood of um it's a confessional posture. We're caught up in this shit.
Yeah. 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 Yes.
hmm
And
Yeah.
then
Yes.
Thinking of
something comes
confession as a
next.
just acknowledging what's true, not necessarily admission of guilt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, confessing is just saying the same thing God, like it's just affirming truth.
Hmm.
Right.
Confession is just affirming what's true in a way that is having to agree with God about reality, really, right?
Mm.
What's
Hmm.
real.
Yeah.
And when you say like working towards life, I think of like what is the sanctifying life of a Christian in the Spirit who is a dwelling place for God by the Holy Spirit with among other people? What is it not? If we're living in a creation that's groaning for our revelation, then reparation and restoration. What is it if
hmm
it's not that? So then repentance
Hmm.
isn't something that we do less the older we get or the more the Bible we translate,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's
Uh-huh.
something we get to do more of because that's our only avenue into this life restoring reparative action of
Yes.
holding back death,
hmm
of cleansing the cosmos, and of spreading this contagious holiness that Christ embodied and now makes
Yeah.
accessible to us in the holy of holies in the heavenly places. Like what else is it?
Yes.
Yep.
And so then
Yeah.
if that's what's going on, then it's not about the question isn't how much money can I have before it's sinful?
Hmm.
What a bullshit
Right.
question.
Yeah.
Like that
hmm
it isn't even interesting
No.
because it doesn't even make sense in the thing I just described or the things that we're talking about. It's not even it's like what are you talking about, dude? How much money can I have? That is that is boring.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's boring.
Yeah. Point my imagination towards, are the people who I am responsible for the payroll of able to pay their bills?
Yeah,
Like,
this is great. This is great.
stop.
And
Mhm.
okay, so I'll say this. One of the ways that Mammon reigns is to convince people like the three of us,
Mhm.
because globally we're in the 99%, that if we're going to talk about mammon worship, we're condemning ourselves. So
Mhm.
this is what people will do. You start talking about America's dis-ease with wealth, and the person who never talks about the starving child in Africa will grab them from their trash can and hold them before you to make you sound like you're the hypocrite, right?
Mhm.
This is one way that our imaginations get closed off and shut down.
Right. Unless you
Because,
have no money, you can't. You're not allowed to talk about it.
yes, and it's crap.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
crap.
it's
Those same
gaslighting.
people, those same people, what they're doing is those same people would shame James when he writes James 5.
Yep.
Mm.
Yep.
Because James 5, he's talking about the landowners that withhold the wages of the workers,
Mhm.
right? And how they're condemned.
Mhm.
And that same
Yeah.
person would say, "Oh, are you complaining about not getting your wages today? What about the people that didn't get the job in the marketplace?
Mhm.
You're more wealthy than them. Maybe you should just be happy with what you have. Maybe that landowner worked really hard and maybe they're taking on the risk of owning land so they can provide you a good job."
Oh. Ah.
That's why they're doing that, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can keep going with that
No, yeah,
crap,
it's
Yeah.
right? So they would shame James for making the point James is making.
Mhm.
Mhm.
They would shame the widows in Acts 6 for complaining about food distribution.
I
Because
mean, you're
Yeah.
talking.
because you're getting food, you aren't starving.
Yeah.
You're not in the If you're eating today, you're in the top 50%.
I
Yeah.
mean, you're talking about how using Mammon uses piety behaviors from the spiritual disciplines you talked about a few minutes ago to judging others and esteeming character and moral worth to
Mhm.
perpetuate domination and submission to those with more power. It is
Yes.
using a sacred tradition actively for harm and making, one word mean the complete opposite.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So those disciplines, there's nothing wrong with almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. In fact, they're like the core disciplines of Second Temple Hebrew worship.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
and even after the temple falls, they're still so important in Judaism to this day,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? But you have to pay attention to the details in those condemnations. How are people using those things? And who doesn't have the privilege of using those things in the same way?
Mhm.
They're using good gifts to create partiality based upon their access to the resources that lets them do those things.
Right.
And
They're
there's a way of um it's almost like a sleight of hand where we learn to look for the piety markers, the piety signaling, almost to say
Mhm.
who actually has the trust and authority, um, instead of actually talking about the real things going on. Like this was Bergman, what's his phrase? The royal consciousness. Like
mm-hmm.
it feels like these two chapters are Jesus trying to, how do I say this? Um, Conjuring up a way of being human, like within domination systems, but apart
Yes.
from them, and how to cultivate an interior life and
Mhm.
a treatment of others that's rooted in, it's constantly pointing back to trust and rootedness in creator, not the dominators.
Yes.
And how it seems like a steady empowerment of the poor and the
Yes.
dominated to be skeptical of what they take of the world as they know it, the structures that make for trustworthy, not trustworthy, authoritative, not authoritative. Like rupture that royal consciousness, call bullshit,
Yes.
and learn how to. Um, I mean, the thing that shocks me here is the next thing after you can serve God or Mammon, but not both, is don't worry, because it's like one of the biggest lies of Mammon is there isn't enough to go around.
Right.
And you should live in
Scarcity.
worry and
Yeah.
fear and scarcity. And like the spirit, the interior remedy that then somehow we figure out how to share together. One of the things is not worrying. Worrying is always telling you, you got to figure out a plan for retirement and get the right return rate on these things. And otherwise, these things happen. There's this scarcity. It
Yeah.
shocks
Mhm.
me that, like, I mean, telling poor people not to worry. What the hell are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. This is part of when I talk about like the logic of Mammon.
Mm,
Mammon withers when people stop fearing uh, death and when they stop living
Mhm.
in competitive scarcity.
Yeah.
It withers, right? It
mhm,
withers. And so there's this
Mhm.
misconception, I think, that Jesus teaches some kind of very rigorous asceticism, that the only faithfulness
Right.
is austerity.
Yeah.
But this guy's throwing parties all the time.
Right.
Women follow him around with purses and they pay for these lavish meals that he invites the wrong people to,
mhm.
right?
Mhm.
He defends a woman who's anointing him with expensive perfume, right? Quoting is it Deuteronomy 15 or 16 at people who feign to be offended by the fact that she's wasting it. So all that to
Mhm.
say is I don't think that Jesus's ideal is some sort of austere asceticism.
Right.
I think it's abundance
Mhm.
Mhm.
and jubilee.
Yeah.
Um, there's
Which
there's this
starts to
verse.
build when you focus on that life that you were talking about
Yeah.
earlier and the holy common distinction and the pure impure. Like
Mm,
if you're working toward what's life-giving for everybody, all of a sudden it starts creating that reality. You're
yeah.
building that community where everyone has what they need and you're sharing and you're working together and you've stopped competing and you've stopped withholding from other people's because I might
Yes.
not have it. All of a
Yes.
sudden there's enough for everybody. How did that happen?
Yes. Yes. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Brandon number one, about the communal reality of people taking responsibility in the Old Testament. And this goes back to what you were just saying, Brandon number
Mhm.
two, about I love how you translate righteousness sometimes here as enact justice, right? Because
Mhm.
because Jesus gives us the how can I not worry? What do you mean don't worry? And he says, desire first and foremost God's kingdom and righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Here's an example of how Mammon has done us dirty. When we hear God's kingdom and God's righteousness, we think of churchy spiritual things.
Right.
We don't think of God's political economy that makes
Mhm.
divergent, unique claims on our possessions, our time, our affection, our jobs, our relationships,
Mhm.
than the prevailing political economy of the world, which I would describe in Jesus' day and ours as Mammon. So he's saying
Mhm.
pursue the alternative political economy of God's rule
Mhm.
and do justice according to that logic, and you
Right.
will have abundance.
Mhm.
This is the same point I brought this up
Yeah.
earlier. This is the same point that God makes in Deuteronomy 15, which is what Jesus quotes, the poor you'll always have with you. I don't know how many
Mhm.
times I've heard people say that as a way of excusing the fact that we shouldn't try to do anything about poverty because God says the poor you'll always have with
Mhm.
you. So there's no need to do anything about it. But that is, I think I've filled my bullshit quota already, but that is
Mhm.
bullshit.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
such
Yeah.
bullshit
Yeah.
because in the what Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy 15 is about how you cancel debts,
Hmm.
and in a very Jewish way. In a very Jewish way, the Deuteronomist is like, you're going to cancel debts. And so there will be no need for any poor to be among you.
Hmm.
And then later he says, but if you do have poor among you, and then at the end he says, and the poor will always be with you.
Mm.
And it's this teaching that
Ouch.
reveals two things. Listener, go read Deuteronomy 15 and watch how that happens.
Yes.
God promises if you live by canceling debts and living in this economy of abundance, you don't need to have any poor.
Mhm.
But, well, we all know humans, right? But if you do have poor, here's what you should do.
Mhm.
And since you're not going to even do that, the poor will always be
Right.
with you. And so you must do these things.
Hmm.
And it's just this, it's like this amazing way of teaching, first of all. But when Jesus quotes it, he's condemning it, not
Right.
affirming it.
Yeah. It's an indictment. Yeah.
It's an indictment.
Would that
Yeah.
we could only hear it as that.
How are we so jacked up, guys? I don't know
Yeah.
how we got so far off.
Ugh.
But anyway, I do think one of the logics at work here, sorry,
Yeah.
enacting God's way of being together under God's
Mhm.
political economy,
Hmm.
you will have all these things added to you. And we see this over and over. The kid who offers fish and bread and it's multiplied. We see this in Acts
Mhm.
2 and Acts 4. That's happening, right? We see that enacted ethic bear out. We see Paul asking the Gentile churches to give to the Jewish church in Jerusalem that's experiencing famine, and he roots it in this kind of logic. We see it over and over and over again. And so,
Mhm.
you know, it's nice to name these artifacts like this, like you mentioned scarcity, Brandon. The scarcity mentality, and I mentioned competitive profit.
Hmm.
That without competitive profit, there'll be no motivation to work. Who says?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who
Mammon
says?
Without
says.
at least 3% GDP growth every year,
Mammon
there'll be
says
no.
that's what Mammon says. Yes. Yes.
It's a little dot. We need a little like Monopoly man and an angel, not a demon. Like,
Right.
it's really
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we should let's keep going into chapter 7 here, where Jesus is talking more about like don't judge. He's talking
Mm.
about um
Yeah.
how people
I want to
pray.
hear what you, yeah, I want to hear what you have to say about these first six
Yeah.
verses here, Matt. Because
Mm.
it still got my wheels turning as you were talking about some of the other things, um, about judging and like, wait a minute, who is Jesus actually addressing here, within
Yeah.
this framework that we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So reading the Sermon on the Mount with the poor changed the primary way I read the Sermon on the Mount in this way. I always read Jesus speaking to this vast crowd of people gathered around him, peasants,
Mhm.
and teaching them to reform their way of life.
Yeah.
So this audience here, you are the primary people who are judging, and you need to stop it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
He's finger wagging the poor.
He's finger
The
wagging.
masses got to stop judging.
He's
Yeah.
he's finger wagging the masses. But the poor read this and they see Jesus advocating for them because they understand how power works and that powerful people judge the poor in ways that are hella detrimental to them. So now I'm reading it with both lenses. So I'm not saying that poor people can't sin. That's not, don't hear what I'm not saying, right? But there's a reason why the poor followed Jesus, why he described what he was doing was an easy yoke. And it wasn't because he was guilt tripping them all the time. He was Aubrey Hendricks in his book, The Politics of Jesus, where he talks a lot about the economic situation of the people in Jesus's day. He talks about giving Jesus's political strategy, and he talks about giving the voice to the voiceless, seeing the people's needs as holy.
Ooh.
And I think one of the things that's going on here, what I'm learning to appreciate more, Brandon, notice my non-exclusive, it's non-exclusive reading here, is that Jesus is naming one of the ways that people are harmed, and he's naming it to the harmed people.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, he's saying, I see you. This isn't right. I am your advocate, and I'm calling the people harming you and you. Why would you ever want to do what's being done to you to others into a different way of being? Into a different way of being.
That's such a trauma response to domination is to
Yes.
mirror the dominators. Like, I need
Yeah.
to climb this goddamn pyramid and treat
Right.
the other enslaved like a slave master.
This
And
is
it's so woven into our masculinity anxieties in this culture. And
yes. I mean, this is the sociologists tell us this, right? Resmaa Menakem talks about this in my grandmother hands.
Yeah.
Sarah Schulman talks about this in Conflict is Not Abuse. That trauma cultures mirror supremacy cultures.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That supremacy culture is simply trauma culture that has power.
Ooh.
Right. Yeah.
Traumatized people flowing their trauma through other people, right? So yes, there is this mirroring action that's going on. You're right, and I think this is a trauma-informed and sensitive way to read this text that doesn't let the poor people off the hook from what Jesus is saying. It's not an either or, but rather Jesus decides to teach them and catch them up in the kingdom of God by advocating for their needs because no one else will.
Mm-hmm.
He's winning them over by defending and protecting them, which then also wins them to a righteous way of living. Because now they're associated with him, and he has advocated for an end to the violence perpetuated against them. So to do that violence would be incredibly shameful.
Yeah.
And so the way that this culture works socially, for them to do the thing that he has named, given voice to, spent his capital on, denounced, exposed, and overturned in a socially relevant way, for them to do that thing would have been the height of shame. So he can wag his finger at the poor and the rich get off easy. He can defend the poor to the rich, and he catches them both in the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? That's how I'm playing around reading that. What do you guys think about this text? I'd love to hear what you think too.
Yeah, well, some of what you're saying about the trauma culture and the supremacist culture, it makes me think of the Exodus and Leviticus talking about, like, do this, take care of the foreigner among you and all this because you were foreigners in Egypt, right? It's trying to break that cycle of, okay, now you've been freed, don't become the oppressors.
Don't forget. Yes.
Yeah, trying to break that cycle of the trauma culture becoming the next supremacist culture.
Yes.
But yeah, this verse 6 has always stood out to me. And depending on which translation you look at, it's either connected with this first paragraph or it just stands alone as if it's disconnected from everything. That don't give the feral dogs what's sacred and don't toss your pearls to the pigs. And I feel like it has to be connected here. It is in the Greek breakdown, by the way. But and so with this framework of what you're talking about. I'm playing with this, and I haven't settled on anything in particular, but I'm wondering if it's kind of coming back to the beginning of chapter 6 of the like, yeah, don't do your almsgiving, just giving them the crumbs, the pearls. Here's a few pearls from my vast wealth to pacify you. And you know what? They know that
Mm.
it's just pennies, and they're not gonna stand for it for long.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I look at this as a text, as Christ's forming us to have a counter royal, counter Mammon consciousness together, a kind of Christ class consciousness. Um, it strikes me that don't judge so you won't be judged is followed by this from verse 7 down to 11. Um, this thing about what I've always taken to be prayer, and I think is probably the normative piece here, but like, what's the right way of facing reality? Compare these two: judgment, domination, control of what something is,
Hmm.
Mhm.
or request, curiosity, invitation. Um, like maker, like these are two ways of addressing neighbor, world, and the divine. Make a request, like be here comes Ted Lasso. Be curious, not judgmental. Like
Mhm.
that's the medicine
Mm.
alternative.
Mm.
And it's grounded in, yes, take the normative reading of it as prayer, this trust that the divine is um, fundamentally a force for life and not death and judgment in this world. And so no wonder it loops back in verse 12. So always whatever you would want other people to do for you, do that for them, because that sums up Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah. I wonder what you guys think about this. That little right, because it starts out as like a this is how you pray. It's another injunction to
Mhm.
pray, right?
Mhm.
And then uh and then Jesus's so what is the golden rule.
Mhm.
Therefore, treat other people the way you want to be treated. That's the Old Testament in a nutshell. Boom. That's what he says. That's what he says.
Yep.
And that's to me, that creates all kinds of questions about what I thought he was talking about.
Mm.
Mhm.
Right? Because that would we would have. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's a better way. Maybe you guys have a better way to understand this. But the way I typically think about it is, oh, here's some good words about prayer and a nice little tag on how to treat other people.
Mhm.
Why? Two things. But typically, there's one thing Jesus is doing in these little vignettes, these little, you know, these little these little pericopes. And so when he says that, it makes me wonder. It's very social. See, notice, ask and you will receive,
Mhm.
search and you will find, knock and the door will be open. For everyone who asks receives, whoever seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks the door is opened. There's no God there.
Right.
And and then immediately after, Matthew says, who among you will give your children a stone when they ask for bread? So if
Mhm.
he was talking about God, now he's talking about human relationships. But
Right.
maybe he's talking about human relationships the whole time. That like I'm just got right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. I
then
think that's a
the
good guiding direction to look for things in general. It's almost always going to be looking at the human relationships, unless it's clear
yeah,
that this is how
Yeah.
God is doing things, and then
Yeah.
it brings it back to so you should too. Right.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he does say, he does do the how much more thing, right? If
Mhm.
you know how
Mhm.
to give good gifts to your kids, how much more will your father give? But I
Mhm.
think this is similar to the logic at work in like, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors.
Yeah.
I think there's a similar logic here, which is the what we call the horizontal and the vertical are inextricably tethered.
Mhm.
And to try to bifurcate them as two different separate things is
Yeah.
due to
The
this.
material and spiritual.
Yes, is due to this bifurcated universe, two-story universe we have inherited from our,
Mhm.
philosophical tradition. And I wonder if this is more of Jesus teaching about how God provides as we live with each other by asking, seeking, knocking, providing hospitality, sharing what we need with
Mm.
each other. And if you live according to everything I've been teaching you in the Sermon on the Mount and talking about just in this previous chapter, you will discover that your heavenly Father is giving you better gifts than you would give just your family.
Mhm.
That flows,
Yeah.
man. And
Back to
like
the
Right?
the
abundance.
way all
Yeah.
those little like section headers that every Bible puts in there and just like chops it up, like
Yes.
here's like
Mhm.
some random koans that Jesus says, but they
Yes.
non sequitur like crazy. It's like get those bolded subheadings out of the text and just read it
Mhm.
as literature and trust that there is an actual flow. Like give
Right.
Matthew and Jesus a little bit of credit here.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not putting that in the commentary anywhere. I'm just wondering out loud with you guys
Yeah.
since it's fun to
Yeah.
do
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'll put it in if you want.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would then, I mean, prayer is also a theme, right? Prayer
Mhm.
is also a theme in the Sermon on the Mount, but it would then
Mhm.
comport with what are possessions for? How do I get my daily needs met? It would be
Mhm.
another expansion upon what Jesus has already talked about in asking, seeking, knocking, um, is a very culturally defined behavior,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I mean, there is an inherent request element to the words used for prayer. And if you go back and look at the last chapter with the Lord's Prayer, it is very much making requests. Like, take care of our basic needs here, please.
Yeah.
Don't let things get even worse than they already are, is basically how it ends.
Hmm.
Yes. Yes. Oh man.
Brandon, I want to hear
Yeah.
part of what made you decide that we should go back through Matthew. Our
Hmm.
first season was going through Matthew. Um, but like we need to go through this again. Was as you were giving a revision on it, some of these things post-election were popping into
Hmm.
shape, preparing for a future of much more explicit authoritarian behavior in our
Mm.
country.
Yeah. Yeah.
This Some of these verses were important for you.
Yeah, it's true. It was, I started thinking about all these phrases throughout Matthew and other places too, but in Matthew in particular, like let the reader understand, and whoever has ears to hear, let them hear, and all these kind of pay attention to what I'm saying that I'm not saying quite explicitly because that would probably get me killed. Um, and connecting the dots there with this talking about knowing their tree by their fruit. Um, and real, it occurred to me because it's always been this very hyper spiritualized tradition that I've read from of so it must be talking about who really has a relationship with Jesus right now or who's going to heaven when they die. Like how do you know which people are in and which people are out if you can't just take their word for it? And then it occurred to me when I was having all this thought in our current reality is like who the hell cares who's going to heaven when they die? I don't give a shit. And but so why would I even bother trying to figure that out with this? But what it is it's connecting it with the hungry wolves up in here,
Mm.
the fake prophets disguised as sheep, but underneath they're hungry wolves. It's not just about who's going to heaven when they die, who's really a Christian and who's not. It's who is going to oppress you and use violence to control you, use their resources to gain more power and take from you in that competitive profit scheme, and who is part of this community that you can actually trust, who's working towards this life-giving abundance way of being. And therefore, knowing who it's even safe to be around, like physically safe to be honest with and live your life next to.
Yeah. Yeah, like as I hear more and more people talking about how do we kind of do off the grid mutual aid support and care, underground railroads for people that are being shipped away from
Mm-hmm.
their families, people that are being targeted actively by a bully on the
Mm-hmm.
East Coast and his minions everywhere. um,
Yeah.
the sense of like, how do I know which of my neighbors I can freaking trust? Like, like Jesus is like stoking this like consciousness among poor people, and you got to be discerning. You do need to be able to be discerning of some level of character. Like, don't let the fellas who get up there and beat their chests and talk about how raise their hands the quickest in worship and um humble brag about all how devoted they are. That's not how you can know who to trust when you're figuring out how to protect and be safe together as vulnerable and dominated people.
Hmm.
It's character, it's fruit.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
And
noticing
that
too.
context matters.
Yeah, it does. I'm noticing too just that like there's some kind of we see this we see Jesus signaling to certain people talking in code. Um, when Jesus says foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, or
Mm-hmm.
go tell that fox what you've seen, right? There's animal there's animals associated with people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in John's gospel, we see Jesus also talking about wolves, but he's talking about wolves getting into the sheep pen, and
Right.
then he calls the wolves thieves,
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
right? And often the thief coming to kill and destroy gets associated with, the devil.
Right.
But in the context of Jesus's teaching, the thief isn't the devil, the thief is the wolf, and the wolf is the religious leader.
Right. Yeah.
you know? And so I do,
Consistently.
yes, consistently. So I do wonder here, again, Jesus indicting the bad behavior of religious leaders to those who primarily suffer under that bad behavior. Now, other places he denounces them, right? Very
Yeah.
famously, whitewashed tombs, et
Sure.
cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but here he's kind of speaking in I don't know, code language isn't great, but speaking in, language that isn't super direct and explicit
Mm-hmm.
to name the harmful things happening to his audience
Mm.
Right.
and even validating, like, you don't have to trust wolves, man.
Mm-hmm.
Here's who you should trust. And he ends it with three teachings. Trust the people who do the stuff I've told you.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
He says it three times at the end, three different ways. Do the stuff. Don't talk about the stuff, right? Don't have authority position where you get to enforce and legislate the stuff. Do the stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm.
There's just so you asked me at the beginning of this thing, like, why do I post what I do on social media?
Yeah.
I, Seeing how Jesus treats the needs of the people as holy, and he does it sometimes by, like, giving a mother back her son, but he also does it in teaching by telling the truth about the harm people are experiencing. There's good that
Wow.
does.
Naming it for what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's violence.
Yeah.
Yes. This is why it feels bad, because it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Weird.
I'm trying to do that in a very compromised, speaking of Mammon, compromised arenas, Facebook. I'm trying to do that
Mhm.
in a space that is complicated and confusing and complex, but it is there are people who have been gaslit and told that their harm is actually for their good, and in ways that no one else is like just speaking like, no, that's actually harm.
Mhm.
And speaking to those people, you're doing different work than if you're speaking to the ones doing harm.
Yeah.
Right. They're both
And
important, but it's different.
yes, and what I've learned from Jesus is it's really hard to speak to both of them at the same time.
Oof.
Mhm.
Really hard.
Yeah.
Like I can think of one time off the top of my head when Jesus does that, and it's in John 8 when he writes in the dust and tells both of them, but he speaks directly to the men and says, if whoever's without sin casts the first stone. I can think of one time when he's engaging both a harmful person and the one experiencing harm.
Yeah. And even then it's not you have sin, you shouldn't be doing this to her. It's
No.
I'm just gonna leave that there and you do with it what you're gonna do.
Yeah.
But
I mean, maybe Simon the Pharisee, when he's grumbling in his heart, if he knew this woman was a sinner, he wouldn't be okay with this. But even there, he's not speaking to both of them.
Mhm.
He's speaking to Simon on her behalf. And so I think there's work that Jesus does that's very particular with people who have power and are causing harm. And that work is different than the work he's doing with people who don't have power and are experiencing harm.
Yeah, that's a huge distinction.
I'm trying to learn how to do that same thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like a Jesus-y thing.
Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah. And maybe each person is not necessarily called to focus on both. It seems like John the Baptist focused much more on the latter, speaking to those causing the harm, and it got him killed a lot earlier in the story than Jesus got killed for it.
Yes.
Jesus spends a lot of time talking to the people being harmed, and then at some point decides it's time. And then it was fast. It goes in and triumphal entry saying, guys, it's about time for me to die. Starts flipping tables, and sure enough, within days, he's dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I love how much just you scratch a little bit of the sacred story and it explodes with all of this, man. It's part of what keeps me a Christian. It's like there's too good of energy, too healing and disruptive of energy that comes out of these stories to not be moved by them. Thank you both so much. Thank you, everybody listening and watching, for your company this leg of the journey. Thank you, Matt, for taking time out of your day to join us in exploring this sacred text together.
Yeah. And what an honor to talk about the scriptures with you guys.
You've brought so much for us. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or review on whatever app or player you've been enjoying this on, especially YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Gotta appease the robots. Makes it easier for more people to find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. You can read the Liberation and Inclusion Translation at litbible.net and follow its developments on Threads as @lit.bible. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads as @OldSongNewDance. And you can follow me on Threads as @BD Rhodes. Matt, what's the best way for people to find you?
Yeah. Let's see. I have a Substack. It's just my name, Matt, MA with three T's, EBBE at .substack.com. That's my newsletter. We mentioned socials. I'm still on Elon's dystopian Nazi algorithm site.
Yeah.
You can find me there and on Facebook at Matt Tebbe. And then those places will tell you everywhere else I am too.
Perfect. Thank you. The music you're all listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Founding Translation was produced on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
By Brandon.
Bye, everybody.